I want to talk a little bit about movie ratings and the regulation of film content. This is a subject that Giglio discusses in the textbook, and I wanted to highlight in an additional discussion here because it's very important and it's something that's often misunderstood about American film. At one time, government in the United States censored movies. We tend to think of democracy meaning that there's freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and of course that's true. But in the United States, there was a long tradition of government censoring movies. This was done typically at the state and local level, where there were laws that prohibited the depiction of obscene materials, or especially violent or graphic or objectionable type stuff. And these laws effectively meant that filmmakers had to be careful when they made their movies, and they had to avoid controversy, and race relations in particular was something that filmmakers generally avoided very strongly. And if a filmmaker had made a film that was considered to be provocative with regards to race, then local governments would simply prevent it from being shown. And this had been supported by law in the United States. In 1915, the Supreme Court had ruled in a case known as Mutual Film versus Industrial Commission of Ohio that movies were considered a business, and Congress, under a very long-standing precedent, had very broad authority to regulate business activity. And as a result, film was not really considered to be free speech or free press. It was a business activity, and therefore Congress or even local governments could regulate it. I have this quote here: "The exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, originated and conducted for profit," the court said. "It's not to be regarded as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion." So in 1915, the Supreme Court established the precedent that government could regulate film content. And in the 1930s, Hollywood developed what became known as the Production Code, and Giglio discusses this in the textbook. Be sure and read that. The Production Code was created to address the problem posed by censorship laws in the U.S. around the country in these various states and communities, and you had different laws throughout the country. There was no national censorship laws, but all sorts of local laws. And so how were the theaters going to make movies that didn't run afoul of local communities? Well, what Hollywood essentially did was create a standard that would apply to all the studios. It would allow them to basically follow one set of rules in making sure that their movies could be shown everywhere throughout the country, because this set of rules, of course, was effectively a self-imposed form of censorship, and it was done to basically efficiently comply with local censorship laws. Now, prior to the late 40s, really 1950s, movie production studios, the big names we've heard of, Paramount and Universal, MGM, they owned local movie theaters. And so you had the big movie studios control the production of movies, but they also controlled the distribution of films. They owned the local theater where people would watch the movies. And so you had this tightly controlled system. And what this meant was that the Production Code was effectively this self-censorship system that applied to basically every movie shown at every theater in the U.S., because the big studios were basically where all the movies were made. Filmmaking, after all, is a very complicated, expensive technology. Certainly was in the early part of the 20th century. And so there's limited access to filmmaking technology, and the big studio houses owned all the local movie theaters, and so you had this very tightly controlled system, and effectively this Production Code becomes this censorship system that applies to basically every movie shown at every theater in the country. So the production system is created in the 1930s to provide these morality guidelines for the Hollywood filmmakers. And of course it meant things like nudity, adult language were completely out of the question. Even references to things like divorce were discouraged, if not outright prohibited. The production code was enforced by the Motion Picture Association, which goes on to become the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, which still exists today. And the Motion Picture Association is essentially the trade group, the business association of all the Hollywood movie studios. And they create this organization called the Production Code Administration. And this PCA, the Production Code Administration, would certify movies, and if they were certified, that meant that the film had met the standards of the production code. Effectively, it meant that the film had been censored or had complied with the censorship rules that the Motion Picture Association imposed. And again, if you wanted your film, if a film was going to be shown in a theater, it was going to be shown in a theater owned by a Motion Picture Association studio, and the studios were all on board with the Production Code Administration, the PCA. All of this really collapses in the 1960s with some legal challenges, with the rise of independent filmmakers, and changes in the ownership of movie theaters in the United States. So what happens? Well, in 1948, in a Supreme Court case known as U.S. versus Paramount Pictures, which is also known as a Hollywood antitrust case, the system of the studios owning local theaters was found to be uncompetitive and in violation of antitrust laws that prohibited monopoly practices. Effectively, the Supreme Court allowed government regulators to force the studios to sell off their movie theaters. It was ruled that by allowing the studios to actually own both the means of production and the means of distribution, they effectively were shutting off movie competition within the industry. So they were forced to sell their theaters. Now this clearly broke up this tight-knit control that they had previously had on films. And a few years later, in 1952, in a case known as the Miracle Decision, which related to a film of that title, and the official case is known as Joseph Burstyn versus Wilson, the Supreme Court overturned that previous decision and said that film censorship was in fact prohibited by the Constitution. And in 1952, the Supreme Court ruled that movies were actually protected by the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of press protection. And so the Supreme Court overturned that 1915 decision in Mutual Film Corporation that I mentioned before. So in a span of 4 years, you have two very important Supreme Court cases that really transform or open the door to transforming filmmaking in the United States. So these two decisions, I should say, broke apart the Hollywood studio oligarchy, and it opened the door to filmmakers at least having the possibility of making movies free from government regulation, because now, after 1952, the Supreme Court rules that movies enjoy First Amendment protection, and of course, studios begin to lose their control because they no longer own the local movie theaters. They can only produce movies, not distribute or sell them at the local level. Now, this didn't happen right away. These decisions came, again, in 1948 and 1952, and it's a number of years until you start to see changes. And, of course, to some extent, these changes are spurred along by cultural changes and political changes in the 1960s. But it was clear that by the 1960s, things were changing, and changing quickly in the film business. Filmmakers increasingly were using adult language and violence and sexual situations in their films, things that had never been dreamed possible in 10, 20, 30 years before, because there's no longer a production code to stop them. The studio tight control had been broken, nor was there any government regulation, and perhaps just as importantly, people were buying tickets to these movies. They were popular. People wanted to go and see movies where the language wasn't sanitized, etc. In response to this, the Motion Picture Association of America created the MPAA rating system. And this is the rating system that we know of and exists to this day. So the MPAA rating system, if anybody's seen a movie, you're familiar with G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17. It was created in 1968 by the MPAA. And by the way, PG-13 did not exist at that time, and the rating of X was for adults only. Although X-rated quickly becomes associated with pornography, and the MPAA drops the X rating, and now there's a rating of NC-17. This actually didn't come along until the late 90s. But anyway, the MPAA rating system that we're all probably familiar with today was created in 1968. And the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, which is still the Hollywood filmmaking industry trade group, has an organization within it called the Classification and Rating Administration, or CARA as it's known. This Classification and Rating Administration may sound like it's a governmental bureaucracy, but it's not. This is simply part of the trade association group of Hollywood studios. Now, CARA views the films that are submitted to it by directors and studios, and they're voluntarily submitted. CARA doesn't require that they that filmmakers submit their movies to them. But prior to their public release, CARA screens these films and then applies their standards and attaches a rating to a movie. Note that MPAA ratings are not direct regulations of movie content. The director, the producers who underwrite the film, all of those folks decide what goes into the movie. And again, to make it clear, to reiterate the point, movies do not have to be rated. There's no requirement that a film, legal requirement I should say, that a film be rated, and film ratings are not done by the government. This is often misunderstood by people, and I can't stress this point enough. Movie ratings in the United States are not government regulated, they're not government mandated, they're not required. They are entirely voluntary, and the government is not involved in the movie rating business. This is done by a Hollywood professional association, a movie-making professional association. But by policy, most theaters in the United States will only show MPAA-rated films. Now, this is not a law or a regulation, but it is a movie theater policy. And in the United States, over 80% of movie screens are owned by only 4 companies. You've probably heard of all of them, or at least some of them: AMC, Regal, National Amusements, and Cinemark. These 4 mega corporations, multi-billion-dollar businesses, all 4 of them, own the vast majority of movie screens in the U.S. The typical mall multiplex where most people see movies are owned by these companies. And these 4 companies will generally only show MPAA-rated films in their theaters. Now, because they own the vast majority of movie screens, they're effectively the gatekeepers to the vast majority of U.S. moviegoers. Most ticket sales occur through these 4 companies and the 80% plus of movie screens that are seen at your typical mall multiplex. And if a filmmaker wants his or her film to be shown at the local shopping mall theater, which is where the audiences are, the big money is, the big audiences are, they have to go through the MPAA rating systems. So this isn't mandated by law or regulation, but as a result of market forces, by the fact that there's only 4 companies that own all the theaters, and these 4 companies have made it a policy they will only show MPAA rated films, if you want your movie to have commercial success in the United States, wide-scale commercial success, and you want to hit the big audience pool that's out there, you've got to go through the MPAA rating system. Now, that's not to say that there aren't movies that are made that are not screened by CARA and the MPAA. There are. Many foreign films, of course, are generally not submitted to CARA for ratings and are not rated. And, of course, there are independent filmmakers in the United States who can make a film and not submit it to CARA for ratings. They're not going to have their film shown at your local mall multiplex. But they could be screened at local independent theaters. And these are typically referred to as the art house circuit. These are small independent theaters. They are much fewer in number, but they're around. You find them mostly in big cities and cosmopolitan areas and in big college towns. These art house cinemas will show unrated films. They'll show import foreign films. So there is a bypass to the MPAA rating system. But note that these independent theaters, because they represent a relatively small slice of the movie-going business, are not where most filmmakers target their movies. Most filmmakers are going through the typical Hollywood studio production system, and those films are typically shown at your mall theater, at the Showcase Cinema, and of course it has to have an MPAA rating for that to happen. And by the way, in the Boston area, there's a few art house cinemas, the Stewart Playhouse, Brattle Theater, and Kendall Square is the big one in Cambridge. Coolidge Corner Theater is actually one of the biggest in the area. And in Providence, the Cable Car Cinema near Brown University and the Avon Cinema are also independents in the area. But note that this is a relatively small number of theaters when one considers the vast number of multiplex movie theaters in the Boston area. There are some criticisms of the MPAA ratings, and Giglio talks a little bit about this in his chapter. I want to talk about a couple of these criticisms. One criticism you often see leveled against CARA is that they will tend to allow a lot of graphic violence, gun shooting and bombs blowing up and people being hurt through violence, and give these types of films a PG rating. But if there's a passionate love scene and we see some nudity, the MPAA rating of R comes out very quickly. And so one criticism that's often leveled is that the CARA MPAA ratings tend to be more lax when it comes to violence, blood and guts and that type of stuff, and somewhat prurient when it comes to sex. The other criticism that's often leveled is that because of the market forces involved with the MPAA ratings, there's a financial incentive here for directors and movie makers to play ball with CARA, to go through this rating scheme in order to have their film show in the vast majority of theaters in the United States. And this has the potential to impact artistic freedom. It is considered among movie makers now that the NC-17 rating is a very bad move financially, and a lot of contracts that involve the funding of films will now stipulate that a director will create a film with a rating, a CARA rating of R or PG-13, which is now the most popular form of rating. And if there's something in the film that would cause the rating to be stricter than that, then the director is going to be in a position that they have to cut it out. And some have suggested, therefore, that a director's freedom to make their film may be constrained by the MPAA rating system, that the way they want to make a movie may not be the way it comes out because they have to comply with MPAA ratings. This, I think, is a very legitimate criticism of the rating system. But it is important to remember that the ratings are voluntary and they do not involve government regulation. But there's no question that market forces here can constrain the artistic freedom of filmmakers, and this is done via the MPAA rating system.